Welcome to part 3 of my Sega Ages 2500 coverage. In this episode we're going to take a look at 8 more games in the series, which include a couple of really classic Model 2 fighters. Let's get right to it. In March of 2005, Sega would take Phantasy Star 2 and give it the same facelift it gave the first game by releasing Sega Ages 2500 Volume 17, Phantasy Star Generation 2. Much like the revisions to the first game in the Sega Ages 2500 series, this one would get the same graphical upgrade across the board. High-resolution playfields, overworld maps, battle sequences, and conversation boxes are all now in much deeper colors, as well as tons of added detail. Liberties have been taken with the art style, and the characters have been touched up in ways that differ from their original designs a bit, but everything still looks great overall. The battle sequences in particular look great, and take the original's plain blue grids and adds copious amounts of color and environmental detail. The music gets a makeover as well. It follows in the steps of the first, sounding very much like the original, but different enough that fans may be put off. I enjoyed it overall, and it was still familiar enough to have all the emotional drive of the original. The biggest departure from the first remake is that Sega left the difficulty alone this time, and if you're a Phantasy Star 2 fan, you know the game was freaking challenging as hell. This one retains that challenge, and requires a measured approach to the world and its systems. You run in like you own the place, and that's exactly what you'll get, is owned. This one pulls no punches, and even with me knowing where to go and what to do from the original, I still found myself fighting for my life in numerous battles. The battle systems see the brunt of the changes in this release, and have numerous additions and options. I quickly adapted to these, and found myself really enjoying the game. Thankfully, there is a full-on English patch for this release that does the original script proud, and if you're a Phantasy Star 2 fan from the old days, this game will gladly bring back all those glorious memories of getting your ass kicked, while giving you enough new to drive you to defeat the Mother Brain all over again. As a side note, the English patched release includes a patch for the original Phantasy Star 2 on the disc as well, making it fully playable in English. Sega Ages 2500 Volume 18 Dragonforce was easily my most anticipated release in this series, and in August of 2005 it became a reality. If you've watched my channel enough, you know that this was my favorite Sega Saturn game, and one of my favorite games of all time. It's essentially a strategy RPG where you play in King of the Hill style battles. The overworld map screen is populated by kingdoms, with each kingdom having castles in them. Your job is to defend your kingdom while assaulting the others. Once you take over a castle, you can place your generals there, recruit troops, and use it as a staging ground for further incursions on the enemy's territory. Once a kingdom is defeated, you'll have the ability to harness its manpower by recruiting its fallen generals. All of this is tied together by an easy-to-follow story that only intrudes to set you along to your next mission. The PlayStation 2 release here stayed remarkably faithful to the Saturn original in regards to gameplay and systems, only really adding a few new characters to the story. The biggest change here is in the storyboards, which now feature all new art that has been redrawn with more color and higher resolution. Other changes include remixed music, filtered sprites on the playfield, and some new voice work. Other than that, it's remarkably close to the Saturn game. The lone black mark on any recommendation I can offer is the game's Japanese language barrier. A new gamer coming into this will be quickly overwhelmed by Japanese menus and sub-menus, not to mention you will not be able to follow along with the story in any real detail. Worse yet, There are a few very story-specific missions that you must do throughout the game. With no clue what's going on, it's very easy to get stuck. Those of you that are Saturn vets will be able to navigate these perils easily, so I recommend this title to you wholeheartedly. To the rest, Dragonforce is still a game that holds up very well, and if you're a newcomer to this game, grab yourself a guide to help you through the trouble spots, and you'll still find something here very much worth playing. Released out of order, Sega Ages 2500 Volume 19 Fighting Vipers would actually be released before Volume 18 in April of 2005. This port of the Model 2 arcade game would right some of the wrongs with the earlier port of Virtua Fighter 2 in the series. Backgrounds now look much nicer and closer to the arcade original, with most of the blurry textures that plagued Virtua Fighter 2 now gone. The game also runs at a great frame rate, offering both 60 frames per second and arcade faithful 57.5 frames per second options. Characters also look great and retain all of the polygons of the original build. Sega did not stray far from the arcade in regards to options, and you'll only find single player, versus, and ranking modes here. Gone are the recording and training modes from the Saturn version, as well as the awesome Pepsi Man character. That begs the question, is a bare bones arcade port of Fighting Vipers worth the investment? Absolutely, as this game still rocks, and the PlayStation 2 port here is affordable at around $20 or so. The Sega Saturn version is still the premier version of this game to own in my opinion, mainly for its extras and perfect gameplay. But what's here is pure arcade goodness, and you'll be hard-pressed to put it down once you play it. Give this one a shot. It's a great arcade port of a game that rarely gets its due respect. Sega had received a ton of criticism for some of the early remakes in the series, so to try and make it up to the fan base, they would release Sega Ages 2500 Volume 20 Space Harrier Complete Collection in October of 2005. This collection of Space Harrier games includes the original arcade release, the North American and Japanese Master System port, the Master System Space Harrier 3D, as well as the Mega Drive version of Space Harrier 2. Sega would also give this one a host of visual options, such as 480p and 240p support, as well as filtering options to smooth over the sprites. The most important addition to this compilation is of course the arcade version of the original Space Harrier. It looks and plays fantastically here, with a mostly smooth frame rate that preserves the awesome superscalar feel. Analog stick support really feels good in this release, mimicking the old arcade flight stick setup and overall smoothness. The sound and music are fairly solid as well, and I didn't notice any outstanding flaws in the reproduction. Space Harrier 2 is another thing entirely, however. It looks just awful after playing the arcade port, and has a number of emulation issues with the sound. The Mega Drive version of this game was never top-notch, but playing it here right next to a vastly superior version, you really take notice of just how much difference there was between the quality of these releases. This is magnified by 1,000 once you get to the Mark III and Sega Master System versions of Space Harrier, as they are virtually unplayable at this point. Again, being side by side with the arcade does not do any favors for these releases, making them look just awful in comparison. The Mark III version is a mess of choppy scaling effects and reduced quality sprites. Even the music, something I once enjoyed, takes a nosedive next to the arcade's glory. Space Harrier 3D has the added curiosity of being able to be played in 3D with a kit that was included in the game's original box. But even this novelty is quickly extinguished due to the even choppier gameplay and graphics. What we have here is a compilation that is its own worst enemy. These games are virtually identical in setup and gameplay, so jumping one to the other is a quick realization that while the arcade version is an old school masterpiece, the home releases were just wannabes that failed to deliver.
Get ready.
Also in October of 2005, one of the most disappointing additions to the series would see release in Sega Ages 2500 Volume 21 SDI and Quartet Sega System 16 Collection. First, let's get something out of the way. The Sega System 16 was an arcade board that had some of Sega's best franchises on it. It was there that Shinobi, Golden Axe, Altered Beast, E-SWAT, and even the success-developed Cotton were born. To label a disc the Sega System 16 collection and have none of these games on it is a crime in my opinion. What was even worse was that we got two games that were, in my view, some of the least appealing games from that hardware. We'd first get SDI, a twin-stick shooter that pitted you against an invasion force of ships and missiles trying to destroy the planet. Offensive mode is a side-scrolling game where you must shoot down enemies before they get past you. You then go into a defensive mode where you must destroy what you missed in a missile command style gameplay segment. If you miss too many, it's game over. The original arcade actually used a joystick to move around and a trackball to aim, making the dual analog sticks of this PlayStation 2 release replicate that experience perfectly. While the game isn't awful at all, it lacks any real replay value. Stages are short and extremely similar, and the difficulty will drive most away in minutes. The Master System version, released in the West as Global Defense, is a shell of the arcade. The graphics are far weaker, and the control method is terribly cumbersome, making you use a button to switch between moving and shooting. The second game on the list is Quartet, a 4-player run-and-gun that reminds me of a mix between Contra and the Goonies 2 from the NES. You fight your way through various stages until you get to a boss-like character that you kill to get the key to an exit. This game can be enjoyable in short bursts and offers a pretty solid challenge. The Mark III port would lose the 4-player support and be renamed into Double Target and take major hits in the graphics and sound departments. It's a nice addition, but not one I'd want to play over the arcade version under any circumstance. None of these included games are terrible, but the Sega System 16 was a classic piece of hardware loaded with unforgettable franchises. None of them are present here, making this misnamed and sparse compilation a complete and utter disappointment. In February of 2006, Sega would release a remake of the Mega Drive classic Sega Ages 2500 Volume 22 Advanced Daisen Ryaku. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this one, as the language barrier here is an absolute burden to non-Japanese reading peoples. This is a World War II turn-based strategy game that allows you to choose a country and manage it throughout the war. You must defend your territory and manage incursions into other countries. This version has seen some refinement in a few areas, such as new 3D battle sequences and a redone soundtrack. Outside of that, however, the game remains remarkably close to the Mega Drive original in virtually every other way. Again, the language barrier is a huge hurdle, making trying to play it a true exercise in patience. If you are a fan of these types of games, I recommend you take a look at Daisen Ryaku 7 Modern Military Tactics for the PlayStation 2. It's fully localized in English and a much more playable experience. Another out-of-order release in December of 2005, Sega would bring 5 of its early arcade games to Sega Ages 2500 Volume 23 Sega Memorial Selection. If you own the 2 Memorial games on the Saturn, you've played a few of these. These 5 games received major makeovers to their presentation, but unlike early Sega Ages releases, these remained in 2D and actually improved the overall experience significantly. We start first with Head On, a game I am not fond of. The remake here takes the old gameplay of a car trying to avoid hitting another car and turns it into a sort of mixture of Pac-Man and Kicks. You must collect the dots as a beam of light and avoid the other killer beam of light trying to stop you. It's fun for a few minutes. The second game is Tranquilizer Gun, a hunting game where you must capture animals by putting them to sleep and then dragging them to your vehicle. This one receives a huge makeover and is actually quite fun. The difficulty ramps up quickly, giving you a great challenge. It's quite an upgrade to the original arcade and an enjoyable curiosity. The third game is Borderline, a twin-stick shooter and the darling of the package. You are a tank tasked with destroying enemy bases, and you have 3 weapons you can choose at will. The standard machine gun has endless ammo, and is good for general destruction. The laser weapon is a heavy damage attack that uses your special meter and only lasts for a short amount of time. Your flamethrower is good for an area of effect damage, and again uses your special meter. While Borderline is hardly a deep experience, its brand of destroy the hell out of everything on-screen action has great appeal. The fourth game is Congo Bongo, one of Sega's early arcade successes. It's also a game I can't stand. It's a platformer that uses an isometric perspective, and as some of you know, this is not my favorite way to play. The graphical overhaul is nice, but the gameplay is so frustrating from dying because you miss easy jumps that you'll want to smash your PlayStation 2 controller against the wall. The fifth and final game is Doki Doki Penguin Land, a delightfully fun puzzle platformer in which a penguin is trying to rescue its eggs from enemies and get them home. You break blocks to move the egg throughout the stage, avoiding environmental hazards and enemies along the way. Again, the presentation has been overhauled nicely, and this one here is a great trip down memory lane if you were a fan of the arcade or home versions. This entry into the series was not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be, and with winners like Borderline, Tranquilizer Gun, and Doki Doki Penguin Land rounding out the package with varied and well-presented upgrades, it's a fine addition to the Sega Ages line. June of 2006 would bring us Sega's often forgotten Model 2 fighter, Sega Ages 2500 Volume 24, Last Bronx, Tokyo Bangaichi. I have always been a fan of the Saturn release of this game, and I was really excited for an arcade-perfect port. This release would introduce a few extras not found in the other Model 2 fighting ports in the Sega Ages 2500 series, mainly the addition of a moves list and the much appreciated progressive scan support. The result is a game that looks and runs impressively, and is extremely close to the arcade original. The gameplay is solid as well, and the options to run the game at both 57.5 frames per second and 60 frames per second returns. This version of the game is extremely difficult even on the easiest setting, following the arcade version to the T. You will not get anywhere simply mashing the attack buttons in this one, and you'll need to counter effectively to get anywhere. This gives the game a strong replay value, and it nudges you to try all the characters to find the one that best suits your desired playstyle. You'll also get the ability to save your match replays, allowing you to capture that come-from-behind victory you eked out by the skin of your teeth. This is helpful when analyzing your losses, giving you better ideas on how to use your move lists and counterattacks. The glaring flaw in this package ends up being the sound presentation. It's overly loud and very distorted, even at lower volumes. Last Bronx never had an epic soundtrack the likes of Virtua Fighter 2, but it would have been nice to be able to play it loud. It sells for around $30, so it's still worth your attention, even if you already own the Saturn version. Now you're going to notice that the Sega Ages 2500 series really begins to morph with this set of games right here. Sega begins to sort of take a more hands-off approach with changing things and updating things. They pretty much just want to put games together in compilations or just straight port games instead of really messing around with the graphics. Sega really took a hit on that first batch of games that were remaking the classic with these really budget graphics and additions that gamers just simply did not want. So Sega begins right here, right now, to really change this series. And this next batch of games coming up in the next episode reflects that unbelievably. And man, does this series really start to get good. I'm Sega Lord X. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll catch you next time.